So, guys, Donald Trump, in his speech to Congress on Tuesday night, name-checked a small country that some people listening might or might not have heard of.
In the African nation of Lesotho, which nobody has ever heard of.
So, guys, I'm going to put you on the spot. Where is Lesotho?
I mean, I believe that it's an African country, but beyond that, I couldn't tell you where in Africa it is.
Colby?
Yeah, same. I thought for sure Naftali was going to know, though, and I was going to be so embarrassed. But but I feel a lot better that Naftali doesn't know either.
It is completely surrounded by the country of South Africa.
Aaron, did you know where it was before last night's speech?
I actually did because I like maps.
Aaron.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and host of the Post Reports weekly politics roundtable. It's Wednesday, March 5th. I'm joined this week by Naftali Ben-David, who's a senior national political correspondent for The Post. Hey, Naftali.
Hey, good to be here.
And we've also got with us today democracy reporter Colby Ickowitz. Hey, Colby.
Hey, Aaron.
So we're bringing you this roundtable today instead of Friday this week so that we can break down President Donald Trump's address to Congress last night. We're going to be getting into the highlights of the speech, the responses from Democrats, and a major subplot that even some Republicans fear could jeopardize Trump's second term, and that's his tariffs, which have already been rattling the U.S. economy. So, Colby, we all watched the speech last night. I wrote an article about it. People can go on the Post website and look at my takeaways. Let's just get right into it. How did Trump kick off his address to Congress?
Well, Trump came out in bold Trump fashion and told the United States that America is back.
Our spirit is back, our pride is back, our confidence is back, and the American dream is surging bigger and better than ever before.
He then declared that he had the biggest electoral mandate in decades, which of course we know and you've written about, Aaron, is not true.
Definitely not true.
Barack Obama had much larger wins than Donald Trump did in 2024. So when Trump declared this massive electoral mandate, Democrats started booing and the Republicans started chanting, USA, USA. And you knew at that moment that this speech was not going to be your typical speech to a joint session of Congress. Notably, this is not a State of the Union. It felt like a State of the Union. It had all the makings of a State of the Union, but it's just a joint address to Congress. It's just like an important little subnote to make there. But then you had Representative Al Green, a Democrat from Texas, stand up and start hollering that the president does not have a mandate. He does not have a mandate.
Members are directed to uphold and maintain decorum in the House and to cease any further disruptions.
It did not feel like the kind of somber occasions that we're used to seeing around these events. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when a congressman yelled, "You lie," at Barack Obama during a joint address to Congress. And it was like the biggest scandal because it was considered such a breach of decorum.
Yeah, and we had a couple Republican members of Congress in recent years jeering at President Joe Biden as well, Lauren Boebert of Colorado and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia.
Exactly. But Al Green got escorted out of the chamber.
Mr. Green, take your seat. Take your seat, sir. Take your seat. Finding that members continue to engage in willful and concerted disruption of proper decorum, the chair now directs the Sergeant-at-Arms to restore order. Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
So within the first couple minutes, you had all of this drama, this kind of reality television drama that created this tension right off the bat.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some more details of the speech, but I wanted to get a sense for what you guys made of the overall tone of this speech. You know, not just the reactions from Democrats and things like that, but what did Trump seem to be wanting to convey in this speech?
Well, to me, it was very much like a campaign rally. I mean, for those of us who've had the experience of watching him at campaign rallies, it really wasn't that different, but for the setting. He went after Joe Biden, who, as you may know, is no longer president, a dozen times. He just couldn't stop talking about it. He mentioned Kamala Harris. I mean, it was very political. It was very full of bumper sticker kinds of statements. It wasn't a laundry list of policy ideas as these things used to be. It just was combative and political.
So another key moment came when Trump brought up Elon Musk, who was in attendance, was actually wearing a suit. And Trump started reading off the things that Musk had been targeting along with the Department of Government Efficiency, the things that Musk has been cutting or is targeting for potential cuts. And one moment that I thought was really potentially telling here was when he started talking about supposed fraud in the Social Security Administration. Let's hear that tape.
Believe it or not, government databases list 4.7 million Social Security members from people aged 100 to 109 years old. It lists 3.6 million people from ages 110 to 119. I don't know any of them. I know some people that are rather elderly, but not quite that elderly. 3.47 million people from ages 120 to 129. 3.9 million people from ages 130 to 139.
So people might have heard some cries of false and the groans that were largely coming from the Democratic side of the aisle, of course. And that's because this is something that has been floated by Musk for a number of weeks and has been fact-checked. These appear to be issues of coding rather than fraud. But guys, I was really struck that Trump spent what I think was about 3 minutes on running through these numbers. What does it say about Trump that he would spend so much time on this, Neftali? What is it? I feel like this is kind of telling about his approach to politics, right?
I mean, I think there's two things that it says. One is that this was a speech that was impossible to fact check in real time in the sense that people watching it didn't have any exposure other than the Democratic catcalls that you mentioned responding and saying that what he was saying isn't true. He's certainly known in the past for when something makes a good talking point or a good story, he will repeat it long after it's been debunked. The other thing I think it says is that he's very aware of what makes good television. And I use that maybe metaphorically. It makes good TikTok. It makes good Instagram. You know, the way he built older and older and older, it made it sound like, oh my God, how can we be paying Social Security to 200-year-old people? How could such a thing be allowed to occur? And the fact that it apparently is not occurring in any sense didn't deter him and doesn't deter it from being a good narrative. And I think that's what that was all about. And Democrats, I mean, they tried to protest, but really they were powerless. He was up there. He had the podium and the microphone, and he could make his case, and there wasn't much that people could say about it. I'm sure all the fact checkers, including our own Glenn Kessler and others, will look at this and will repeat that it's been debunked. But how many people will see that as opposed to how many people will see, you know, let's say the TikTok reel of him, you know, making that point, and it's sounding so dramatic and so shameful, and to say that he and Musk are tackling that very sort of thing.
Yeah, another key point from this section, which I think is worth noting, is that Trump described Musk as the head of Doge. This is a key point in a lot of the lawsuits that are trying to stop what the Trump administration is doing. The administration has said that Trump is not, in fact, the administrator of Doge, and we're already seeing some legal filings that are pointing to Trump's words. So that's certainly a subplot worth watching.
And just to add a little bit to that point, the reason it matters whether or not Musk is the head of Doge is there's a question of whether or not somebody in that position needs to be Senate confirmed. And I think the reason that they've argued in court that he's not is because that argues against the need for Senate confirmation. But every time that Trump says this guy's running Doge, of course, it weakens that legal argument and strengthens the case for the need for Senate confirmation for somebody with that kind of power and authority.
Yes. Guys, I wanted to also turn to something that happened pretty late in the speech when Trump got to the issue of Ukraine. This, of course, comes after last week's blow-up with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office, a series of Trump's actions which have shaken U.S. allies in Europe. Guys, was there anything about what Trump said about this issue that stood out to you? And did this really move the ball forward in any meaningful way?
I mean, it did suggest that there was a little bit of a reconciliation happening. He read what he said was a letter or a note from President Zelensky.
The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts.
That purported to be in favor of this minerals deal, that thanked the American people for what they've done. Some of the points of contention during that explosive Oval Office meeting a few days ago. So it was a way of sort of signaling that things are perhaps a little bit more back on track. But, it was only one of several moments during the speech where I think he purported to make news or to create a little bit of drama. He held up an executive order. I mean, the speech was punctuated by various moments when Trump seemed to suggest he was making news right on the spot. And I thought that was one of them.
It's reality television, right? Trump knows how to make television. And so I remember him doing this in previous State of the Unions during his first term, where he would have, one of the guests in the First Lady's box stand up and kind of make a whole spectacle out of that person.
Yeah, and there was the time where he gave the Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh in the middle of the State of the Union address.
Oh my gosh, I forgot.
Well, and he also staged a reunion between a returning serviceman and his family right in the middle of the address, and it was dramatic, and it was hard not to applaud. And I think he loves creating moments like that, and he is a gifted showman, and I think that was reflected again last night.
So, guys, one of the biggest questions ahead of this speech was how Democrats were going to react to it, what they were going to do. The parties really struggled to find a message to counter Trump, and the Republican Party is largely unified right now. Democrats tried a number of things during this speech. What did they do, and what did you make of how they handled this speech?
Well, I think there were an array of Democratic responses last night, which reflected the battle within the Democratic Party about how to respond to Trump in general. There were some people who boycotted it altogether. Some of them had counter-programming of their own. Some made very vociferous responses, like Al Green. Others responded with various levels of raucousness to things that Trump said. And then we had the Democratic response, where Senator Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan gave a fairly moderate, middle-of-the-road kind of answer. So I think that just as the Democrats more broadly are trying to figure out how to respond to Trump, last night, they were specifically trying to figure out how to respond to him in real time.
And you had Democrats that did choose to attend. A lot of women wore pink, which they said was going to be a new protest color for women. Women have often worn white, a reflection of the women's suffrage movement. Now they say their protest color is going to be a bright pink. And so you saw a lot of pink on the Democratic side last night. You saw some of them holding up kind of bingo paddles that said things like must steals and false. Some had the word resist on their clothing. There was a Democratic congresswoman who was holding up a sign as Trump first came in, and it's saying, "This is not normal." And so you have these images of Trump walking down that aisle, and she's holding this sign behind him. And I think a Republican on the other side of the aisle actually ended up grabbing it and throwing it on the ground. And so, Democrats had various ways of trying to resist and push back. I mean, Aaron, I think you actually wrote about in your takeaways, they laughed sometimes when Trump made comments that were false, or, when he said this thing where he said we're going to get rid of unelected bureaucrats, and they all kind of pointed at Elon Musk and laughed and groaned.
Yeah, I thought the laughter was actually maybe the most effective thing they did. Like, we've actually seen this before where Trump kind of gets thrown off by that. And I think that happened on at least one occasion during this speech. They laughed a number of times. And for me, it recalled the 2018 address that Trump gave to the United Nations General Assembly, where he actually made a similar claim to what he made in his speech last night. He basically said his first 2 years as president had been, I don't know if it was the most successful ever or one of the most successful. And the leaders in the crowd laughed at him, and he didn't kind of seem to know what to do with it. And so I kind of wonder if that reinforces that sometimes a more subtle approach is warranted rather than your, Al Green shaking his cane at Trump at the start of the speech, which I'm not sure a whole lot of Democrats love to see.
Well, we know that Trump does not like to be laughed at. It makes me hearken back to the White House Correspondents' Dinner when he was the butt of all of Barack Obama's jokes and planted the seed maybe that he actually would run for president. Some people say that was the catalyst for Trump running, because he just couldn't stand this idea that he was being ridiculed in this room full of important people.
Well, his style is so self-aggrandizing. He talks about being the greatest president, greater than George Washington. He talks about having done more in a few days than any other president has done in 8 years. He says these things that so strain credulity, even if you're a Trump supporter, that I think people who aren't already in his camp, they naturally are going to laugh. And this highlights one way in which this was different from a campaign rally. His campaign rallies are populated solely by people who love him and are willing to stand in line for hours to see him. So when he says things like that, they cheer and applaud. But when you're addressing the United Nations, or like the other night when you're addressing Congress of the United States that has members of both parties, those statements aren't going to be greeted with that kind of approval, and sometimes they're going to be greeted with laughter. And he did seem to be a little distracted when that happened because he's not used to addressing an audience that isn't fully in his camp. And every time people challenge him, whether it's Zelensky in the Oval Office or Democrats in the U.S. Capitol or foreign leaders at the United Nations, it throws him off. And so I think that sometimes Democrats use that as a tactic, knowing that that may be his response.
Yeah, maybe we'll be seeing a little bit more laughter in the future and maybe less El Green. After the break, we'll be back to talk about Trump's comments on the tariffs that the U.S. just imposed on Mexico and Canada and how they're playing politically. We'll be right back. So Colby and Naftali, I wanted to spend some time on one of the biggest stories right now, and that's tariffs. The Trump administration officially rolled out its 25% tariffs on nearly all goods from Mexico and Canada this week. And Trump spent some time during his speech making the case that they're a key part of his economic policy. Perhaps most notably, he also seemed to acknowledge that they might cause some economic pain. Let's hear a little bit of that part of the speech. Here, Trump is talking about other tariffs that he's planning for next month, which would include tariffs on agricultural products that come into America.
The tariffs will go on agricultural product coming into America, and our farmers starting on April 2nd. It may be a little bit of an adjustment period. We had that before when I made the deal with China, $50 billion of purchases, and I said, just bear with me, and they did. They did. Probably have to bear with me again, and this will be even better. That was great.
This was actually not the only time that Trump mentioned a little bit of an adjustment period. He said, bear with me. Naftali, this is really striking from Trump, who has previously pitched tariffs as kind of like a win-win, like basically all these countries just give us a whole bunch of money, even though these are taxes that are generally paid by U.S. consumers. What did you make of this kind of shifting tone that we saw from Trump on tariffs?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he's starting to grapple with the political and economic reality that these tariffs he's imposing will or might have a little bit of a jarring effect on consumers who are already upset about high prices. I mean, that moment jumped out at me too, because the way Trump usually talks is in absolutes. And so for him to sort of offset a little bit about what he's saying and to mitigate it by saying there's going to be some adjustment, he didn't quite get explicit, but you could tell what he was saying. To me, that shows that he is very attuned to the political and perhaps economic consequences of what he's doing. And it is so uncharacteristic of him because, again, he always talks in sweeping, vivid terms and rarely says, but there might be a bit of a downside before we get to the good part, that the fact that he did that showed to me that he's acutely sensitive to what might be coming.
And I wonder, Aaron, if you would mind if I take the hosting hat for a second and turn the tables on you, because you are our resident polling expert, and Naftali brings up the idea that this might be politically unpopular, and President Trump might be starting to realize that. What are the numbers on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth noting the reasons that this appears to be a dicey move is because economists have for a very long time talked about how tariffs lead to inflation. And of course, we are coming out of a period of sustained high inflation. That was a big reason that Donald Trump won the presidency in the first place. And what we've seen in recent weeks, really, is that while people during the 2024 campaign generally seemed to like the idea of tariffs, or at least marginally liked them, as they've kind of consumed what these could mean, they seem to have turned against them to a significant degree. And that's especially the case with these tariffs on Canada and Mexico. If you look at polls of the Canada tariffs, these are like 2-to-1 unpopular right now. And about 7 in 10 Americans worry that these tariffs are going to lead to price increases. And so we've already seen the tariffs being implemented lead to kind of this unrest on the stock market, the massive fluctuations, the big drops. Producers and manufacturers are worried about what this is going to mean for their bottom line. And so I think it's pretty clear that this is at the very least going to be that kind of, quote unquote, little disturbance that Trump talked about. But I really do wonder how much patience people have for that, guys. Like, are people going to put up with more inflation if they can connect it to this actual Trump policy that he's now put forward? It just seems like a big risk to me, right?
Well, notably, Aaron, President Trump campaigned on this idea of lowering prices for Americans. And a lot of Americans voted for him because they thought he was going to bring down the price of eggs and milk and lower their grocery bills. And yet that wasn't something he really talked about last night. He didn't really address the fact that prices have not come down. And when he did talk about inflation, he blamed it on Joe Biden and did not acknowledge the fact that he said on day one, prices would come down for Americans. And so it's a great question of whether or not all of these people that voted for him, hoping that it would ease their economic pain, are going to tolerate more economic pain.
Yeah, I thought it was really telling that he brought up the issue of egg prices, which of course have gone even higher than they've been in recent years due to the avian flu that we're seeing around. And basically he blamed it all on Biden. He said the prices had gone up under Biden. Well, they've gone up significantly more since then. So you kind of wonder how long the blaming the previous administration is going to satisfy people, given that Trump talked about, bringing inflation down rather quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's been in office for something like 6 weeks, and so he can still call it the Joe Biden egg price inflation or whatever he called it, and he can talk about, catastrophic EV policies. And, he mentioned Biden like a dozen times, but this may be the last major opportunity, I think, that he has to do that where it would have any political salience whatsoever. And particularly because I think it's now been integrated into people's minds that tariffs can lead to high prices, that should prices continue to spike, I think there is going to be a natural tendency to tie the two together. And I think that's a real danger zone for a politician. When people feel personal suffering and personal hurt, and they're able to tie directly to the policy of the guy in charge, I think that's a problem. In the Biden years, it was tied successfully to Biden's stimulus plans and to some of what happened during COVID. Well, now Trump is undertaking this very stark, controversial policy. And if prices go up, I do think that in many people's minds, it's going to be tied very directly to what he did. And there will be political consequences for that.
Yeah, and we're already seeing polling of Americans showing that they're not exactly happy with Trump on the economy, which was always his strong suit in his first term. And I've been really struck by polling that shows large numbers of Americans don't think that he's paid sufficient attention to the issue of inflation. A CBS poll recently showed about 66% of Americans said that Trump had not spent enough time focusing on inflation. So certainly a subplot worth watching. Naftali, just to go back to this issue of tariffs, I think there's always a question in here about how much of this is actually Trump's intention and how much of this is a bargaining chip. And we're already seeing Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick coming out and suggesting that maybe these tariffs on Canada and Mexico could be alleviated to some degree. Just today, we saw that Trump said the tariffs on automobiles would be delayed by a month. Can you just give us a little bit of a state of play on where things stand and whether these 25% tariffs are actually going to be our reality for the foreseeable future?
Well, a couple of things. I think that one clear thing that it is a way to show dominance. I mean, that's something that Trump likes to do domestically. He does it by firing people and filing lawsuits and saying people should be locked up or whatever it is. And from a foreign perspective, this is his way of showing who's in charge. The pretexts for them seem to change. I think that's one indication that they're less a direct policy issue and more of a way of showing who's in power. And this is a little bit speculative, but I honestly think he's improvising a little bit here. And if they somehow seem to be going in a good direction, he'll keep them. And if they seem to be unpopular and the stock market's dropping and the businesses are complaining, then he'll claim victory and say that it was his, amazing tariffs that led to whatever policy concession he can lay at the feet of Mexico or Canada. I'm speculating based on past activity, but I think that he's going to see how it goes, and then he'll decide whether it's something he wants to keep permanently. But something he always has in his back pocket is the ability to claim victory, say he won major concessions, and then lift the tariffs and take a victory lap.
Yeah, and of course, we've already seen him ease the tariffs, or at least delay the tariffs a month ago on Canada and Mexico, despite some rather modest concessions from those two countries. So we'll see how all that plays out. Guys, just kind of the 60,000-foot view here. I guess I was towards the end of that speech last night. It was interesting, and there were some tense moments. But I also kind of wondered, did we really learn a whole lot about what comes next? Did we really learn a whole lot about Trump's intentions? What do you guys think this does or doesn't change about what we can expect from his second term?
I mean, I think it just reaffirmed that he's not going to be particularly conciliatory. I mean, maybe there was a couple exceptions, the way he talked about, Greenland was one interesting thing. He sort of said he would welcome them. And he also talked
he said, we'll get Greenland one way or another, I believe, is how he put it, which is
right. He was very
somewhat ominous.
Right, that part of it was ominous. But in other parts of his remarks, he seemed to be reaching out to them. But my broader point was just that he didn't seem to be, not that this is a surprise, but backing away from anything. And I think it reaffirms the idea that what he's going to do is push as hard as he can on every front. He's going to push against foreign countries, the courts, the federal government, Democrats, until somebody pushes back in a way that's effective. And we don't know what form that's going to take. Maybe the stock market will drop. Maybe, the midterms will come around and Democrats will retake the House. But he's going to push on every front until somebody stands in his way, I think. And that message came out very clearly last night.
I think also it showed that he's not backing off of his relationship with Elon Musk. Elon Musk has been a controversial figure in this administration. Obviously, he's unelected. He's unconfirmed by the Senate, and yet he plays this major role in our government right now. And Trump recognized him and praised him, called him the head of Doge, to your point earlier, Aaron. And so even though there's been protests around Musk and Democrats were holding up these signs that say Musk steals, it doesn't seem like Elon Musk is going anywhere.
Yes, one of many issues that we'll be watching in the days and weeks to come. But that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Colby and Neftali.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.
Neftali Ben-David is a senior national political correspondent for The Post, and Colby Itkowitz is a democracy reporter. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sam Baer. It was edited by Lucy Perkins with help from Rachel Van Dongen. I'm Aaron Blake. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.